parents pushed me out of the house to make space for their so-called golden child, and then, years after they finally got the daughter they had been longing for, that same daughter ran away from home at just 13. Now my parents are desperately reaching out to me, imploring me to come to their rescue, while apparently having told my sister a twisted version of events that paints me as the one who walked out on them. The reality is so much more complicated and painful, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that they would lie to their own daughter about why I was forced to leave. Growing up, I always carried a sense of being an embarrassment or a letdown to both my mother and father. They openly yearned for a daughter, and for an extended period, they had tried without success. When I was born, they made it obvious that my arrival, as a son, didn't meet their biggest dream. I remember overhearing them refer to me as extra, or even leftover, on more than one occasion. I didn't fully grasp how hurtful that was back then, but as I matured, the impact of those comments became incredibly clear. It felt like I was a placeholder kid, an accidental addition they never really wanted. When I think back, I recall family gatherings where they would discuss their hopes for a daughter so openly that it made everyone around them uncomfortable. They would even respond to people's well-meaning comments with statements like, "If we don't get a girl, it's like having no kids at all." For a long time, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining their disappointment, but it was all too plain to see. When I turned 15, they finally got their wish. My sister was born. She arrived like a shining beam of everything they had prayed for, and they absolutely showered her with love, money, and their undivided time. Once she was a part of the family, I became virtually invisible to them. Any minute speck of attention I had once received evaporated overnight. It was almost as if my very presence in that house became an afterthought. Sure, they had never been doting parents to me in the first place, but it got much worse once my sister was there, front and center. They had no time to care about my interests or my activities. They were far too busy celebrating every breath my sister took, as though she could do no wrong. At some point, I realized this was my new reality. She was their top priority, and I was just an extra mouth to feed. By my 18th birthday, it was glaringly obvious they wanted me gone. There was no party, no heartfelt speech, no sense of pride in how far I'd come. Instead, they summoned me for a sit-down that had nothing to do with cake or presents. They told me, flat out, they needed more room for my sister and that I was draining resources they could devote to her. At the time, I pleaded with them for a short extension, just a couple more months so I could gather enough money to rent a place of my own. They shut me down instantly, insisting I'd had sufficient time to prepare. At that point, it didn't matter that I was still just a teenager fresh out of high school with minimal savings. They had no interest in waiting around. So, they packed me off with a few bags of my clothes and whatever scattered cash I had, sending me out into the world like I had no significance in their lives. Those first few years on my own were brutal. I bounced between friends' couches and ended up in a dilapidated apartment that was barely livable. I cobbled together income by working a string of exhausting and often underpaid jobs, night shift at a convenience store, backbreaking construction labor, anything to keep the lights on. At times, I couldn't afford more than a meal or two a day, and I experienced those long, lonely nights not knowing when the next paycheck would clear or if I'd be able to cover rent before getting kicked out. Despite everything, I kept attempting to reconnect with my parents. I guess deep down, I wished they still cared. Occasionally, I'd phone them and try to update them on my life, or even just see if they wanted to hear from me. The conversations were painfully short, with my parents sounding irritated or eager to end the call. They never reached out first, not on holidays or birthdays, and never once asked if I was okay. Eventually, I stopped dialing their number. My heart couldn't take the rejection, especially when I realized they really didn't miss me at all. My existence had no place in their perfect family scenario. I learned to live with the hurt and pushed forward, doing my best to bury it in my day-to-day hustle. A total of 9 years flew by in that fashion. I pieced together a stable life with a better job, a modest but comfortable place, and a close-knit circle of friends who felt more like actual relatives than my blood family ever had. My parents were practically a distant memory when, completely out of the blue, I received a call from them a few days ago. Hearing my mom's voice after all those years sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I almost didn't answer, but I had a strange feeling it might be urgent. They claimed they needed to discuss something about my sister, and to my shock, they told me she had spiraled out of control as a young teenager. She was skipping school so frequently that the administration had threatened serious consequences, mixing with a crowd of older, sketchy people, experimenting with harmful substances, and even brushing up against legal issues. My parents said they paid huge amounts of money to extricate her from trouble, tried counseling sessions that apparently led nowhere, and had done just about everything they could think of to curb her destructive choices. In that moment, I was dumbfounded. I mean, she was only around 12 or 13. The thought of someone that young succumbing to such severe behaviors rattled me. It sounded like my parents' long-standing habit of spoiling her had finally come back to bite them in a colossal way. Yet, the real kick in the gut came when they demanded I help them, financially and emotionally. They were adamant that they couldn't manage my sister's volatile behavior anymore and insisted that, as their son, it was my obligation to assist. Suddenly, their complete lack of support for me years ago was swept under the rug, and I was expected to ride in like a hero to save the day. They also invoked guilt tactics, proclaiming that since we're family, I should set aside my grievances and rescue them in a time of crisis. I felt my stomach churn. Where was that family loyalty when I was sleeping on couches or pleading for a few more months at home so I could get on my feet? I couldn't help but reflect on those desperate nights when I had nowhere to turn, while they seemed perfectly content pretending I didn't exist. I told them no. I explained that I had established a decent life for myself without their involvement and that I had no inclination to disrupt everything for them now. I saw zero reason to pay the price for their poor parenting and the predicament they themselves had nurtured. The rage I heard on the other end of the line was intense. They unleashed a torrent of accusations, calling me ungrateful and self-centered, claiming I was discarding them right when they needed me the most. Listening to them rant was enough to tear open old wounds and make my blood boil. After hearing them belittle me again, I simply hung up. In the days that followed, they continued to message me, especially my mother, who invited me to some weekend dinner in a last-ditch attempt to manipulate me. I'm torn between the bitterness I feel and that pesky sense of responsibility that makes me wonder if I'm being too heartless. My logical side knows I owe them nothing, but there's this nagging doubt that perhaps I'll regret not stepping up in the future. The question of whether I'm in the wrong for refusing to help keeps bouncing around in my head, although a big part of me thinks they must lie in the bed they made. Time passed, and I found myself needing to share what was happening, so here's an update on the situation. A lot of people have asked why I wouldn't just cut my sister out of my life, and the simple answer is that I don't really harbor resentment for her personally. I never had the chance to know her, so she's almost a stranger to me, an individual who was a baby in my memory when I left. My anger is solely aimed at my parents for how they pushed me away and then tried to paint the narrative that I was the one who had abandoned them. None of the hostility is truly directed at her, even though I realize her out-of-control conduct has contributed to the crisis they are facing now. Other people have also inquired about particular instances in my childhood that drove home the feeling of being unwanted. It's still uncomfortable to talk about, but I realize it's essential to provide context. My parents were never physically cruel, but they were undeniably cold and dismissive. They made remarks about my sister being their miracle child, and spoke about me as if I were a placeholder they got stuck with while longing for someone better. The contrast was crystal clear. My triumphs or proud moments were trivial in their eyes, yet my sister's smallest achievements were worthy of parades. By the time they kicked me out at 18, I'd already endured enough emotional neglect to last a lifetime. Soon after reading everyone's thoughts on the matter, I decided to give my parents a chance to clarify what they wanted, so I invited them to meet me in a neutral setting, a coffee shop. They agreed, and when I arrived, I noticed how aged and distressed they looked. They cut straight to the main point. They wanted me to solve the family's problems. They opened up a bit more than before, confessing that my sister's circumstances were even worse than they had initially described. They'd squandered vast sums on rehab facilities, bailed her out of complicated legal troubles, watched her skip school repeatedly, and recognized that she was associating with peers who reinforced her downward spiral. The mounting costs had forced them to sell their house and move into a smaller space, with their resources nearly drained. After revealing all that, they told me they were relying on me to bail them out. It was painfully clear they viewed me as a cure-all for the damage done by years of indulging my sister. While I felt a measure of sympathy for the stress they were under, I was struck by their overpowering sense of entitlement. They hammered home the idea that I was their son and that family loyalty should override every transgression from our past. Nothing in their attitude suggested real remorse for neglecting me. Instead, they behaved as though their parental title alone granted them the right to request substantial financial support. Listening to them resurrect all those feelings of rejection from my youth made me nearly nauseous. Even after everything, they seemed unable to grasp the notion that they had ever done me wrong, deflecting blame onto me for not simply cooperating. I let them speak at length, but eventually, I delivered my stance. I was not going to take on the weight of their mistakes. I built my life from scratch, and I had neither the emotional bandwidth nor the extra funds to invest in a family that discarded me without hesitation. Their fury and disappointment erupted again, insisting that I was being cruel, and that I was letting my own sister suffer. But there was little more to discuss. I felt my response had to be firm. I walked away, my emotions swirling, partly relieved I'd set boundaries, partly questioning if I was somehow being too callous. Not long after, everything escalated further. My sister herself made contact with me for the first time, an unexpected phone call that left me momentarily speechless because she was virtually a stranger to me. She started off sounding almost friendly, politely urging me to step up and support our parents with financial resources. She detailed how dire their situation was and hinted that I had the power to fix it all. After I calmly refused and explained how complicated our family ties were, she changed her tone in a heartbeat, exploding into accusations about how I deserted them. She railed at me for living an independent life while she claimed to be burdened with caring for our parents. She also said I'd always been envious of her. The words seemed suspiciously rehearsed, like she'd been spoon-fed these ideas by my parents for years. Her self-righteous anger left me speechless. I could scarcely believe someone I didn't even know felt so entitled to demand my help. Before I could get a word in edgewise, she hung up. Seething with frustration and confusion, I promptly phoned my parents to ask if they had been spreading such poisonous stories about me to my sister. They hemmed and hawed momentarily but then admitted they had indeed depicted me as the brother who'd left because I couldn't handle not being an only child. They painted me as a temperamental young adult who refused to share them with a younger sibling. The blatant lie stole my breath. It made sense of why my sister saw me as a cowardly deserter rather than someone forcibly ejected from the home. I ended the call abruptly, my heart hammering from renewed anger and betrayal. All these years, they had successfully buried the truth, turning me into some sort of villain in her eyes. It hurt to think I might have had a real relationship with my sister under different circumstances. The knowledge that they'd systematically driven a wedge between us, purely to absolve themselves of guilt, made me feel both livid and sad. By that point, many people suggested I permanently cut them off and move forward. And as tempting as it was to block them entirely, it's not that simple for me. A piece of me still wants to know what's happening, if only for my own clarity. These people are, for better or worse, my biological family, though it's painfully obvious they see me as nothing more than a convenient resource. For the time being, I'm determined not to initiate contact or give them money, yet I can't bring myself to completely vanish without any awareness of their situation. This dilemma gnaws at me, the unstoppable friction between the rational side of me that wants to maintain the life I fought so hard for and the emotional side that wonders if I'll regret severing all ties. A few months rolled by, and I hoped for calm. My life regained some sense of normalcy because I just stepped away from their crisis, refusing to let them drag me down. Of course, my parents didn't just let it go immediately. About a month after my last attempt to communicate, they bombarded me with calls. Each one was more frantic than the last, and I occasionally picked up, only to listen to them alternate between shaming and begging. They insisted that their finances were on the brink of collapse, that my sister's habits had escalated even further, and that I was the only person who could rescue them from the pit they'd dug themselves into. They threatened, they pleaded, they dredged up the past, and they attacked my character for refusing. Through it all, I kept reinforcing my answer: no, I wasn't going to endanger my own stability for people who had never shown me the slightest true compassion. Eventually, they went silent. About a month passed with no contact, and I truly thought it was over. Then, I got another call. Curiosity got the best of me, so I answered. They revealed that they had to file for bankruptcy due to the staggering costs of my sister's rehab and all the debt accrued from trying to shield her from legal repercussions. They sounded exhausted and at their wits' end. Furthermore, my sister had severed her ties with them entirely and moved in with friends who apparently enabled her ongoing bad behavior. The fact that she was only 13 but managed to walk out so easily struck me as absolutely wild, but it underscores the level of chaos swirling around my parents' home. The strangest part was hearing my parents say they weren't planning to fight for her to come back, as they felt they had nothing left to give. It gave me chills realizing they were all too ready to let go of the child they had once cherished above everything else. In a desperate last-ditch effort, my parents tried to peg the blame on me. If only I had intervened and provided the support when they first asked, they believed none of this downfall would have occurred. Their refusal to acknowledge their role or accept responsibility for pushing me away was astonishing. That's when I confronted them again with all the pent-up frustration from my childhood, reminding them of every slight, every moment I was overlooked, and every plea for help they ignored. That must have broken something in them because they finally apologized and admitted they regretted how things turned out. But they said it as though some magical wave of regret might repair our shattered bond instantly. It was too late for me to pretend their newfound remorse could erase the damage they inflicted. Despite a flicker of sympathy for their plight, I remained steadfast in my choice not to fix their troubles. My life was finally on track, and I wasn't going to risk it all for the same people who had discarded me without remorse. Hanging up on them was an odd blend of wrath, sadness, and relief. I felt sorry for their downfall and for the path that led them there, yet I was proud I had the strength to set boundaries and maintain them. Sometimes I wonder about my sister, if there's a chance we could mend things so she doesn't walk the same lonely road I did. But right now, I'm not at a point where I can reach out. My mental peace comes first, and entangling myself in their chaos would only unravel whatever stability I've achieved. As it stands, I'm stepping away and letting everything else be. Maybe one day, I'll find the energy or the heart to help my sister see the truth and guide her in a better direction. But for the present, I'm staying out of that realm of catastrophe. I've learned to be at peace with the idea that I can't rescue my parents from their own missteps. And though this resolution doesn't exactly feel like a triumphant ending, it's the closest thing to a hopeful new beginning that I have found.